Let's continue with this conversation and speak to accountant and commentator Khaya Sithole, who's joining us live now. Khaya, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And before we even get into some of the talks that could be taking place this afternoon in the ANC's NEC, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one. We just heard from COSATU, and they say that for them, they do understand that a government of national unity is one that will need to include a number of political parties. Don't leave anyone out, but they don't want an agreement between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. Yet now we're kind of hearing them say that maybe include them, maybe don't when it comes to the government of national unity. How do you respond to what you just heard?
Good afternoon to the viewers. So I think obviously the crux of the problem is that the ANC has to form a government. And of course, in forming a government, we are really working on the spectrum of, do they enter into a formal agreement, which comes with its own challenges, or do they simply enter into a less formal alliance, which probably deals with a lot of the anxieties that some people already have. And I think obviously if the ANC can finally find a way to essentially say we've managed to form a government without binding ourselves into a marriage of inconvenience, then perhaps some of those issues may indeed be resolved. But what we're waiting to see is obviously how the ANC arrives at a consensus point that says this is what we want to be able to do in order to make sure that we can indeed form a government after next week. And within that particular conversation, these are the trade-offs and these are the things that we're willing to do or not willing to do in order to avoid alienating our core constituency. Definitely not an easy conversation, but obviously it's one that has to be done.
And just how difficult is it likely to be, Khaya, and these talks, how have, they've been, especially within the NEC itself? Because you hear from the Secretary General, for example, saying that he's aware that they're not a homogeneous group and that they all have different opinions. Given the fact that alliance partners making their stance very clear, some ANC members also coming out in public, making their stance clear, how difficult do you think the talks were behind closed doors?
It definitely cannot be an easy conversation. And remember, even if we're not talking about the conversation of the DA and other parties, the ANC in its formulation is a remarkably complicated structure. It has to really accommodate and really placate many interests that don't always converge towards, a common way of doing things. So even if you are not talking about involving other parties, you still have to acknowledge that the ANC's decision-making is consultation-based. And obviously, sometimes that can be paralyzing in the sense that it takes forever to reach decisions. Now, obviously, now that other parties are being considered, the ANC again has to deal with a very difficult question of whether it can be able to explain to its members the choice that it makes. So if you decide to go with the parties that are indeed breakaways of the party itself, do you not then run the risk of giving the impression that actually the queue is shorter? So if you thought that in the ANC it takes forever to get to a position of authority, well, if you go next door, you still get much closer to that. That's the one risk. And obviously on the other end of the spectrum, the very idea of going into bed with the Democratic Alliance has got ideological implications, where a lot of people will say, but surely nothing we do is ever going to be reconciled. So how do we actually then even form a working alliance here? So again, a lot of trade-offs are going to be necessary, but I think the easiest way to get across the line is to simply say we are going to form a government, even if there is nothing documented in relation to the marriage of inconvenience that we're going to do. And I think if you remember, the EFF in 2016 essentially said, yes, we will offer support, but we're not going to sign any document that binds us so that we can walk away if need be. And obviously that's not desirable at national government level, but I think the ANC will probably regard that as an easier option. Let's work together. Let us not get married.
So when one then takes a step back, Khaya, to December 16, for example, last year, when former President Jacob Zuma announces the MK party, and then we know, of course, what, has happened in the public domain, even others saying that, within the ANC, that they are where they are right now because of what the MK party has done when it comes to the election results. But how much of their indecision around this particular issue of the former president also got them to this point?
Essentially, it is the way they have managed and dealt with the question of their former leader of an extended period that has got them here. And so if you remember essentially how the ANC for an entire decade had to figure out how to balance its own rules, which simply say that you cannot simply remove an ANC president without cause, and also the fact that at national government level, you had multiple motions of no confidence where the ANC had to gravitate and close ranks on the basis that, well, we've elected him and we cannot be told by other people that he has to be removed. And obviously what you then saw last year is, again, that inability to be very decisive in actually saying this is what needs to be done and no member is bigger than the party has really just created that sense of anxiety and a sense of paralysis, in that even when things happen that you kind of work out, well, surely it should be clear to them that, for example, if somebody says I'm going to campaign for another party, I'm not going to campaign for the ANC, why would you then wait until now to actually activate what your own constitution says you must do in relation to members or do things like that? So it's really been a long process of simply avoiding confrontation and not dealing with the issues as they emerge. And unfortunately, once they explode, the ANC is found wanting. And in this instance, it's been the most expensive exercise because they've literally lost a lot of electoral power on the basis of how they failed to deal with this elephant in the room.
Now, Khaya, as a final question then, we heard even earlier on today, Action SA leader Herman Mashaba saying that he is not going to be negotiating with the ANC and also withdrawing from the multi-party charter. Of course, that is Action SA. And I wonder, what do you make of the developments there? Because, one, would have thought that they probably would then still continue with the multi-party charter and maybe continue with this government of a national consensus, as we're possibly hearing?
Look, I think the idea of the multi-party charter was one that was premised on the possibility that collectively these parties could marshal enough electoral of the electoral share for them to be able to pose a credible challenge. Now, the fact that they didn't even get into a close means that there wasn't really much to do. There was not much left to be done with this charter. Now, also quite importantly, you must remember that those that make up the multi-party charter are themselves competing essentially with the same electorate for the same voters. So you don't want to be bound with this agreement when there actually isn't any more agreement. So the idea is to say, let us step away, go back to our own mobilization efforts. And then in 5 years' time, if it then still becomes clear that an alliance of such a nature is necessary for them to stand a chance at being in government, then you can reconvene with a very clear understanding that everybody has gone for the past 5 years and done enough work to actually make sure that more voters can support the sum of the parts in order for this alliance to stand a chance. So the announcement was merely a formality. I don't think anyone can pretend that there's anything worth salvaging in relation to that, given just how poorly they performed in the general election collectively.
All right, Khaya, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. That is accountant and commentator Khaya Sithole.